Hello, Faithful Politics listeners. This is Josh Bertram, the ever faithful, some call me old faithful, host. And then we have our political liberal. What a lib. Will, yeah. Say hi, Will.
I'm the unownable lib. You can never own this lib.
You can never own. And then we have a really special guest with us today. It's Rick Perlstein. He is an American historian. He's a journalist, and he's garnered recognition from his chronicles, especially of the 60s and the 70s, and the American conservative movement. It's pretty amazing to have him on the show with us. Thanks, Rick, for joining us. I really appreciate you coming out today.
I'm looking forward to this. I'm in. I'm not out. I'm right here on my couch, so I didn't have to go anywhere.
Me too, man. It's awesome. So, we were just talking about this before we jumped on to be live, and I'm reading your book, Reaganland, and I found out as I was reading it and doing some research that this is one of three. It's four. So the series is four.
A series of
okay.
Four. Yeah.
It's a series of four. And so let me make sure I get this right.
Yes.
The quartet. This is my test today. Okay. It's, the first one is Before the Storm, and then Nixonland, and then, The Invisible Bridge, and then Reaganland.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Passed. That's it.
Nailed it.
Nailed it. Hashtag nailed it. So I'm excited because I really, I think this is a great topic, an interesting topic. And I think we can just jump right into it. I plan on getting all of the books, by the way, and reading them. But for our listeners, we want you guys to go check out these books. You'll enjoy them. We're sure, and we hope that this interview gives you a little taste so that you'll want to do it. So, if I'm not, I'll get us started here, Rick. So you are politically left,
yes,
right, center, where left. Okay, so why do you care about the conservative movement, and why have you spent so much time in research and writing these amazing books, these long books that I know have taken you a long time to write and meticulous research? What inspired you to do this?
Well, one reason that the subject presented itself to me was that y'all won, right? So as a liberal, knowing the opposition, I don't call anyone in America my enemy, but my political opposition. But I had this very weird hobby when I was young, very young, like a kid. I would get up on Sunday mornings and watch, even though I was a liberal reform, Jew, I would get up and watch televangelists. And I was just so fascinated by the kind of exoticism. It was like some remote, Aboriginal tribe right here in America, that saw the world completely different from me. And I was always fascinated by that. And yes. I think that was my kind of first kind of foray into sociology, history, whatever you want to call it. Basically that was one route into it. Another was that, my parents were conservative when I was growing up. It's funny. My dad he owned a small business in Milwaukee. He always used to say, son, when you have to make a payroll, which was supposedly the natural thing towards which all human beings tend, when you have to make a payroll, you'll get rid of these crazy liberal notions. And the funny thing is, as soon as he retired and didn't have to make a payroll, he's like sitting around watching MSNBC all day, yelling along at the TV with, Rachel Maddow. He hated George W. Bush. And he did, in fact, say that once, he was kind of like, removed from the grind of, kind of being a businessman, he could see things more, broadly. Anyway, so I definitely, was fascinated, I think on a deep psychological level, with him winning the argument with my parents. I think it would be kind of the neurotic kind of answer. And then another thing was the path that got me there was I was absolutely fascinated by the 60s. So I was born in 1969. And by the way, when I started getting fascinated by the 60s and reading books about it and, the marches and the riots and, like the revolutions that were happening, just about every week, which was very interesting compared to the 1980s. One time when I was maybe like an adolescent, I asked my mom, what did you guys do in the 60s? Tell me a 60s story. And I thought they'd tell me the time they went to a march. I knew they weren't really, they weren't in the struggle or anything like that. But at least I figured I'd get one story out of them, maybe. The time they smoked a joint or something like that. And the story was the day they had a riot in Milwaukee, and the mayor shut down the city, so they had a pool party for all their friends who couldn't go to work in downtown Milwaukee. So I mean, in a way, but that's just a way of saying that I was always fascinated with the 1960s. But I also had ended up having a kind of much more capacious view of what it was all about. Because when I was, growing up in both intellectual and popular culture, the 60s was about, the left-wing social movements of the 1960s. That was kind of the narrative. And both because of maybe this, story about my parents, knowing that they had kind of a different kind of 60s where they were kind of retreating behind their slate gray picket fence, in their pool, and kind of protecting what they had, but also the fact that I was spending a lot of time in this giant used book warehouse when I was a teenager, the Renaissance bookstore, when I got my driver's license in downtown Milwaukee, and I would just gawk at these books. And there would be like Black Panther books in which, guys were spelling, America with KKK in the middle. But there were also, books about how the Beatles were a communist plot to, subvert the minds of youth. So there were also like John Birch Society books. And I think I kind of developed this sense that the 60s really was much more like a civil war. That's a much more interesting narrative, and certainly a better description of the influence that the 60s has in our times. So, long story short, I get involved as a professional writer and editor, and I'm looking for a project. And what I ended up arriving at is this 1964 Barry Goldwater campaign, which is the subject of my first book, which was really the first time all these kind of tributaries of the right kind of came together in an era that was supposed to be one of a liberal consensus, and set into motion the forces that eventually culminated in this book, which ends with Ronald Reagan winning the presidency and kind of running against the 1960s social movements.
It's interesting. Now so the majority of the stuff we're going to be talking about is going to be focused on American conservatism, and I'd love to maybe just have you define what that means, because we had Amanda Carpenter on a few weeks ago. Name drop. Yep, I sure did. She made a point to delineate between conservatives and Republicans. So I'd love to.
That used to make sense, but I think there's a pretty much 100% overlap now. Certainly when it comes to public officials. So that's a really interesting and important question. A political theorist named Corey Robin is kind of my lodestar on this one, or my North Star, I should say. He wrote a book called The Reactionary Mind, and he basically defines conservatism as, attempts to preserve hierarchy and authority, against the kind of liberationist movements that are always kind of ongoing, in the history of civilization, basically. And one of the things I like about that, and there's lots of, ancillary kind of qualities that most conservative movements around the world in different times and different places have, but that's basically the core of it. And the thing I like about that definition is it gets around this, conservatives are for big government. No, I mean, small government. Well, no, in fact, the German Kaiser in the 19th century invented their social insurance system, was a conservative, and he wanted to basically buy the loyalty of the working class to support, him and imperialism, right? Conservatism is, against public education. No, in fact, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan wanted a public education system because they wanted to ban, private education because they hated the Catholic school system, right? So it can basically have any kind of all kinds of different policy content, right? As long as, in that particular time and in that particular place, it makes sense as a way to kind of check, as William F. Buckley put it in his resonant formulation in the first issue of National Review, stand athwart history and yell stop, which you can't do, which is why it gets so weird.
Yeah. Now, is American conservatism different than, non-American conservatism?
Well, sure. I mean, it reflects, as all conservatisms do, our own unique history. And a lot of that history is racial, right? I mean, a lot of the definition of what kind of modern conservatism looks like is the particular politics of the Southern ruling class being nationalized, right? Like when Barry Goldwater, one of the delegates for Barry Goldwater at the Republican convention, he happened to be from Texas. After Goldwater won the nomination, said, "We just moved the Mason-Dixon line up to Canada," right? So certainly, the fact that the people who settled the Southern colonies were not people who were seeking, religious freedom. They tended to be people who were given land grants, by the crown, who wanted to basically be, kind of barons, just in a different place, right? And establish, a system, that basically created ranks and orders of society that was, as rigid as any, humanity had ever seen, to that point. But another quality that American conservatism has is that it's been much more radically anti-statist. So kind of the European tradition, you have the Kaiser establishing universal health insurance, right, which wouldn't really be called conservatism in America, because the modern version that I write about is a reaction to the New Deal and the expansion of the state as a check against corporate power, whereas conservatism in Europe is a lot more kind of comfortable seeing itself as kind of a vehicle of a strong state for various reasons.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, Barry Goldwater, and because I've heard his name before, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have, and our listeners range from, Christian to atheist, politically left and right. I mean, they're really all over the spectrum.
That's really cool. You don't see that every day.
I know, we're happy, and I am much more conservative than Will is, and it's but we've been able to be friends so far. So we'll see what happens.
It's an old tradition that the right is kind of abandoned. William F. Buckley is friends with a lot of liberals too. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I hear you mention Barry Goldwater. Who is he, and why is he important?
Well, he's a really interesting guy. He's done the cover of my first book. And to just kind of give it a bit of a historical context, it's important to understand that, in the wake of the Depression, when it really seemed that kind of this small government, business-run society had really failed America, right? And there was a strong sense of failure, and the New Deal came and built, this much stronger state, including, by the way, all the dams that allow Phoenix to have water. So the reaction to it came from the South, but also from the Southwest, in which there was this kind of cowboy, kind of libertarian ethos. And Barry Goldwater was from this old line family, as old line as you could be in Arizona, which was obviously this kind of frontier place. His grandfather got rich, kind of began getting rich by provisioning kind of miners, during the California gold rush, and moved to Phoenix and became basically the family established a department store. So they were kind of one of the first families of Phoenix. And Barry Goldwater came along and became a public figure first in Arizona in the 1940s, and then won a Senate seat in 1952. And he was very charming, very handsome, very charismatic. He flew airplanes. He was into practical jokes. He was a wonderful photographer. When he first ran for office in Arizona, he toured around the state showing a movie, I should say, of him, a rafting trip he took down the Colorado River that was very kind of macho and cool. So he was this really attractive guy, attractive in all kinds of ways. He was a great citizen. He treated his employees well. He was admired by all in Arizona, but he also, despised, the New Deal and the federal government, and kind of really upheld this kind of cowboy myth that his state and his city and had become prosperous without any outside help from the government, which I really do call a myth, because even before the federal government was building dams, they were building military bases in Arizona. It really was in a lot of ways an outpost of the federal government. But he came to Washington at a time in which Dwight Eisenhower really kind of shocked and dismayed a lot of conservatives by accepting a lot of the New Deal, especially after his reelection in 1956. His slogan was modern republicanism. And if you kind of look it up, you can find a letter he wrote his brother saying, people who want to repeal Social Security are stupid, kind of things like that. And he kind of built the interstate system, the biggest federal program ever. He started the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He expanded Social Security. He sent troops to Little Rock when the governor was, basically standing in the schoolhouse door against school integration in 1957. So he was really kind of like a moderate Republican that a lot of conservatives, both the strain of conservatism that came out of the Midwest, but also the Southern and Southwestern strain, kind of considered a traitor, to American values as they understood them. So Barry Goldwater really became a conservative hero for the first time. First of all, by serving on the Labor Committee and taking on the head of the United Auto Workers Union, Walter Reuther, who was this kind of socialist-leaning hero, who was the first guy to negotiate things like free health care for auto workers and stuff like that. And there were these very dramatic televised hearings about corruption in the union movement, mobs, and if you've seen the Irishman, basically it was about the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa. And Barry Goldwater insisted that Walter Reuther testify because he wanted to take this guy on, because he said, I'd much rather have Jimmy Hoffa stealing my money than Walter Reuther stealing my freedom. He was pithy, he was a good speaker, and he was the head of the Senate campaign committee, so he did a lot of touring around, and he became this kind of almost kind of this outlaw hero of the Republican Party. And by 1960, a group of conservatives, I write about all this in my first book, try and draft him for president. And one of the interesting things about him and why he's so important to conservative history is, well, a couple things. First of all, that he was young and handsome and kind of was this kind of counterpart to Kennedy, Right. He and where conservatives were, kind of the stereotype of conservatives were this guy who, with a monocle and, some fat old man, out of Dickens. Here was this guy who, flew jet planes, right, and rode on horses. He looked like a cowboy, super like movie star. But the other thing that's really important about him is, he did run for president, right? So he became the kind of gathering place for all these tributaries, and he lost terribly against Lyndon Johnson, who was running after Kennedy's assassination for the first time for a term in his own right. And basically the plot of that first book of mine was that, the pundits, who are really the real enemies of my book, the kind of, smart ass reporters who think they know everything and can tell Americans what to think. I'll say, well, conservatism is dead. This just proves America's a center-left nation. We're heading towards, what they have in Europe. The South, sure, they voted for Goldwater, but they'll come along soon enough, right? This segregation thing is over. And what I kind of do in the book is show all kinds of portents that things are not quite as simple as they seem. And then the next book basically starts with the Watts riots, and then by 1966, all of the Republicans' losses on Barry Goldwater's coattails become gains by kind of campaigning against the social disorder of the 1960s. That's Nixonland.
Well, that's so cool. So as a historian, like, I'm sure you're used to seeing like patterns and similarities among like certain politicians, presidents. I mean, like we talked about Barry Goldwater, and I remember early in Trump's candidacy, like people were trying to sort of make some connections, between, Goldwater and Trump, and Nixon and Trump, and so on and so forth. Yeah, exactly. So I'm wondering, with the Trump presidency behind us, like what types of patterns do you expect to see maybe with like future conservative presidents, or, like it seemed like Trump was so norm breaking, and like what was strayed so far from traditional conservative norms, that it's almost like he hit a reset button. But I'm curious to kind of get your take on where does Trump fit in sort of the greater
thing about
pantheon.
This definition of conservatism that basically says they're kind of enforcing kind of hierarchy and authority, right? And then Trumpism is not it's not that he's not conservative. It's that he kind of puts it in a different package. He's a different, maybe he's a different kind of conservative, but in a lot of ways, you might even consider him a purification of conservatism. So one, pattern so history, the first thing, kind of you learn in history classes, it's the study of continuity and change, right? So, which just about covers it, right? We study everything. But, a big pattern in the conservative movement in America, it goes back to a basic fact that in a lot of ways, conservatism is fundamentally an ideology of a minority, right? The rulers of society, right? In America, they tend to be kind of upheld as kind of business people, right? Who are kind of like, in a lot of ways, are kind of aristocrats. And so, and this goes back, 19th century and even, the 18th century, going back to, the first conservatives were people who were reacting against the French Revolution. And so you have that trick of how do you win power in a democracy when you're basically not offering kind of material comfort to the majority, right? Which is the basic kind of New Deal pattern, right? The reason people voted for Roosevelt, was in 1936, this huge landslide, was he gave them Social Security. He gave them unemployment insurance. He gave them jobs on these, dams that they were building in places like Arizona, right? So what do conservatives have to give? And a lot of it is, basically, fear of change, right? So they kind of are advantaged by stories that make the world seem kind of scary, and often by kind of playing to, some of the more kind of feral kind of aspects of human character, that your neighbor is scary, right? And at the same time, conservatives in America, certainly, the Reagan ilk, would sometimes kind of play that, kind of open that Pandora's box, of, say, dog whistle, racial politics, but they would always kind of quickly close it and have a kind of public face that was very respectable. So conservatism has always had this kind of two-sided kind of Janus face of trying to kind of stir the passions of the masses through kind of fear, but, this is the dog whistle thing, but trying to make it look like they're not, authoritarians in the fascist mold, right? I mean, a lot of, people in Reagan's generation were people who had a historical memory of the awful toll of, the authoritarian fascist takeovers in Europe. So, just to take a really good example, Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act, right? So he basically voted for people to have the right to do what they wanted with their property. And if they wanted to have two entrances and two restrooms, he's like, well, the Constitution does not give us senators the right to say so. But at the same time, he also was so afraid that the kind of racial backlash against the civil rights movement would lead to more violence, that he actually went to the White House and said if people were exploiting race riots to get him elected, he would drop out of the presidential election, right? In the same way, George W. Bush was perfectly willing to use the fears of the public against Muslims after 9/11 to start this war he wanted to start in Iraq. But at the same time, he understood that if he really kind of weaponized that kind of hatred, that he might have, a Germany situation on his hands, pogroms, our Muslim brothers and sisters. So he said Islam is a religion of peace. What Trump is most discontinuous of is he just dropped completely that necessity to kind of the second part, the second face, the respectable face.
Yeah,
he's just going down the escalator and saying these guys are rapists. And he said, Mexico sending their rapists, and maybe the Middle Eastern guys are too. He said that too. I mean, that's like people forget the Middle East part, right? So his kind of paradigm, and the reason we have to consider the possibility that this is in fact a distillation of conservatism is the fact that for the most part the party went along with him, right? And they dropped a lot of the respectable stuff too. And became much more frank, talking about, well, we should make it harder for people to vote, which is something that I document them saying since the early 1960s. So that's Trump's kind of gift to us as Americans, was kind of dropping the facade of civility that was represented by in its most highest form, someone like William F. Buckley, right, who used 20-syllable words. And just really kind of gave conservatism this idea that this is respectable. This is gentlemanly stuff. This is not gutter politics.
Yeah, because it seems like, and obviously this take's going to be kind of from the liberal standpoint, is that are conservatives not self-aware enough that their autocratic authoritarian, I can't get that word out. You guys know what I mean. Thank you.
Yeah.
like those tendencies. Yeah. Like those tendencies, like, are they not self-aware enough to not see that it's starting to migrate and affect their beliefs and favoritism towards folks like Putin? I'm just thinking, like why is there this
well, that's the Pandora's box metaphor, right? You can't really control it once you open it, right?
Exactly, and like when you're encouraging, or cheering that Putin, offered to debate, the president of the United States, and you're almost, and you're not like, saying, no, that's a stupid idea. He sucks, and we shouldn't be like kowtowing to what he wants, like
to destroy our democracy.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, how is it that conservatives or Republicans, and I know I'm using this very like broadly, not everybody thinks that, but the preponderance of the evidence seems to sort of show that there's more people that believe in Putin's idea of democracy than like Joe Biden's idea of democracy. So I'm curious what do you think about that?
That's a toughie, right? I mean, a lot of it, a definite factor in all this is the greed of people like the Murdochs and the Roger Ailes of the world, and Rush Limbaughs of the world, and the Clear Channels of the world, who supported him on their radio station, that realized that by pushing the buttons of the darkest parts of the American character, human character, really, it's a good show. It's like if you guys saw the Fox News film Bombshell, about Roger Ailes and how he basically treated the female staff as his harem. There's a scene where one of the veteran staffers is describing to a new staffer about how their game works. It's like terrify people, reassure people, terrify people, reassure people, terrify people, reassure people, right? There's a lot of emotional manipulation involved. And there's a saying, the revolution eats its children, right? I mean, once, Fox News, started saying, well, we're going to report on what actually happened in Arizona according to the statistics, even if that cuts against the dear leader's plan to cast doubt upon the electoral votes of enough states to steal the election. Everyone went to the next craziest, the next craziest host. But so there's a lot of money to be made in that, right? It's almost like a science fiction movie, The Evil Genius, who kind of creates the kind of neurological patterns, that most, it's like give basically addict people to fear, So there's that, there's the fact that big business, if they kind of keep people titillated in this way, can keep a party in power that is going to cut them the right tax breaks, right? And then the fascinating thing was the Capitol insurrection happened, and a lot of the biggest consumer-facing, kind of publicly traded companies began to say, "Wait a sec, well, maybe we want off this carousel," which is a fascinating development, right? Maybe they want a little bit more respectability politics back. And then there's a question of, what motivates someone like, a Mitch McConnell, or a Lindsey Graham. And, these are old, this is Shakespeare, this is the Bible, this is mythology. It's, this idea that power corrupts. These guys really, really have a model of public service that really seems to be about aggrandizing themselves and the people around them, and using any means to do so. I mean, that's a story as old as time.
Wow,
it really is. I was one thing that I was thinking, because we were making even these comparisons to Trump and Nixon,
right?
And we haven't talked much about Nixon,
here,
but I know one of the things one of the things you talk about in your book is this organizing of discontent,
right?
That the conservative movement learned how to organize discontent, which I thought was really fascinating. And if I look at the 60s and this whole, it was almost like what happened in the 60s with this revolution. And as in your book, when you're talking about all the things that are going on, like same-sex marriage and universal health care and abortion and the debates around this, and I'm like, I feel like I'm reading something from today.
Yeah, it's the same.
And as I'm looking at it, like when in 2016, I was like shocked that Trump won. Mm-hmm. And then the whole thing with Brexit, which was this whole
international part of it, is something I don't quite understand, and I'm fascinated by very few answers about. Right. Yeah.
My question is, like, for you, because you've done so much extensive study of the 60s and this conservative movement, like what happened, even connecting it to Nixon as you can, like what happened that the conservative movement survived the 60s? Because as you said, there was such tumultuous change.
Right.
And yet we come into the 70s then with Gerald Ford, Carter has a terrible presidency, whatever you want to say, like it just doesn't go well. And then we have Reagan through the 80s.
One of the funny things in the book is I depict all these pundits in 1977, basically after Carter wins the presidency, very closely, by the way. Like I said, these pundits can be really dumb. Basically claiming the Republican Party is going to go the way of the Whigs. Like and you even see that now, whenever a Democrat wins. But what they didn't understand, and what a lot of liberals didn't understand at the time, they're like, oh, we have this Democratic president. We've been working on all these projects since the 60s, like, gay rights, and we're going to finally push it over the goal line. What they didn't appreciate was once the kind of social revolutions, which were very disruptive of the way people saw the world, some people on the right, talked about, God's plan for the family, right? It's like it's mom and dad, and just like it's been, one man, one woman, just like they had in the Old Testament. Oh wait, no, I'm just kidding. But the 70s was when all the 1960s social revolutions were really working their way into the mainstream, right? So you begin to see states passing laws protecting what they called affectational preference, and you began to see, the push for the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, and so all the things that were kind of, the things that crazy radical hippies were doing in the 60s were inside the state capitals in the 70s. So that provided kind of like a rocket fuel. So the answer is, how did they survive the 60s? The answer is the 60s, right? Progress begets reaction. Change is scary, right? So what these guys did, these new right organizers, they welcomed division, and they welcomed kind of corrosive relationship between Americans. And they would actually, when I say organizing discontent, in a lot of ways that's what all politicians do. But what they specifically and aggressively did was actually kind of prospect for things that were making people angry at their neighbors, right? So like the classic New Right campaign was, local issues that were making people angry, right? So the classic New Right campaign that I write about in my third book, Invisible Bridge, was in Kanawha County, West Virginia, which is basically what's the big Charleston, West Virginia, and it's rural, right. And it's rural surround, right? The school board had assigned a new suite of textbooks for all the kids to read, language arts books, English books, that were perceived as paganistic, basically. I mean, these were fundamentalists, right? So, for example, one of the exercises in one of the books that became kind of like the Dr. Seuss of 1974 in West Virginia was compare Greek myths to your own religious myths, right? Which suggests that this is just a story, that the Bible isn't revealed truth. And liberals are very naive about this stuff. They didn't understand that they didn't understand conservatism. They didn't understand
right.
that, people ground themselves in these deep faith, right? So
yes.
It became this huge hullabaloo, and it became such a controversy that someone literally firebombed the school board building. And so where the organizing discontent comes is where the kind of actual model for electing a conservative president 6 years later comes is there's this new think tank, the Heritage Foundation. And they send people down to West Virginia to organize them. First of all, they give them legal help. Literally, they defend the guy who was accused of bombing the school board and throwing dynamite through the windows of the school. But they also hook them up with people who are organizing against quote unquote, socialist textbooks in Texas and California. And their politicians who are picking up on this, and their radio hosts who are picking up on this. So what I kind of narrate, one part of the Reagan Coalition is these people who were looking for the most divisive social issues to basically turn people who weren't necessarily seeing themselves as political actors and turn them into political actors. Right? And a lot of fundamentalists didn't get involved in politics because it was seen as worldly. Right? So it's just a sleeping giant that they awakened.
Well, it's so interesting. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard in political science, there's like this phrase like in group out group, and there's been a lot of really great studies about it. Like going as far back as like I don't know, like early 1900s with like Henry Tajfel, and then there was like a follow-on study in 2014. I think it was like in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where they talked about like this motive attribution asymmetry. They looked at a bunch of like Democrats and Republicans, and they looked at a bunch of Israelis and Palestinians to try to figure out why they think their in-group is so like altruistic and all about love and all about grace and all the
enemy wants to destroy them.
Yeah, and the other guys like represent all the things that are just the opposite, and it's interesting
from your fangs there. Yeah.
Exactly, so I could easily sit here and just think that all the ideas, the progressive ideas, movements, policies are in the interest of mankind, and Josh will think the same thing about the conservative views, but yet we may behind the scenes like vilify each other's like policy standpoints because
you was saying about you, Josh. Nah, just kidding.
I can only imagine.
So I'm curious, like, as a historian, like, are you seeing like the I don't know, like the erosion of commonalities in political discourse,
Yeah, I don't really model it in that way, actually, because I think that the Democratic Party is actually, a pretty pluralist political party with people with lots of different views, right? It does have a centrist wing. They even had a pro-life priest, speak at the convention in 2020, and if you look at, kind of like surveys of whether people want to cooperate, they think that their leader should reach across the aisle and cooperate. Overwhelmingly, Democrats do and Republicans don't. So it's not just a symmetry to, it's not sneeches, like to get to our friend Dr. Some guys have stars and some don't. They're very different kinds of formations, right? And that Republicans are conservatives are much more ideological, basically see themselves fighting, for Armageddon, for fighting, it's onward Christian soldiers, right? They're fighting for civilizational stakes.
Right.
And the striking thing about the Democratic Party to me in my lifetime is all the people they've raised up as leaders whose calling card was pluralism and solicitude towards the other side. I mean, if you look at Barack Obama's famous speech, "There is no red America, there is no blue America," right? Or Michael Dukakis's slogan was, "This election is not about ideology; it's about competence." Or Bill Clinton saying the age of big government is over, and kind of, introducing so many policy ideas that were associated with conservatives. Whereas conservatives, even in the face of all this, became more and more militant. And, to the point where, and one of the ways I interpret the QAnon phenomenon, which is so fascinating to me, is since in a lot of ways the Democrats literally are such a non-threatening party, it's like, oh my God, they want to, shove free healthcare down your throat and build a highway for you, that they had to make up this story literally of cannibalism because there's no there, right? To kind of make a credible story about the Democrats being satanic, they had to make up this, kind of crazy conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And it's not
funny.
Democrats have their flaws and they're not, kind of, intolerant liberals, talking about in ideal types and tolerant conservatives.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I listened to you on I know you were on Michael Moore's podcast Rumble, and I remember like you guys were chatting about but the conservatives have all the guns, or something like that. Right. So like
there literally was a libertarian on Twitter today, a big guy, Matt Welch, who said voting isn't a human right, but owning a gun is.
Yeah, which is so weird.
To get a gun than it is to vote. He said that.
Yeah, and what struck me was like you guys were talking about the the insurrection of January 6th, and I really appreciated what you said about I wish that they would get felonies so they couldn't own guns. Although like I've been following sort of that story. I've been following a lot of reporters, and I'm pessimistic that people are going to be charged with felonies. They'll probably just be charged with a bunch of trespassing misdemeanors, or something like that. Like if you want to listen to some really good political insight, like the Lawfire Podcast is a really great one. And they do a pretty in-depth analysis. And, out of like the 800 people that might be charged when it's all said and done, maybe 30 or 40 might, get the sedition charge, and everyone else is just going to, basically get a parking ticket or something like that. So, it's really discouraging, but no, I just thought that was interesting what you said.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I, when I'm obviously, I mean, I'm very conservative. I'm, excuse me, I'm much less so now than I was. I blame Will. So
well, it's interesting. Churchill used to say, if you're not a socialist when you're young, you don't have a heart. If you're not conservative when you're old, you don't have a brain. But I do find people becoming, like my dad, more liberal as they get older these days.
Yeah, I don't really know what the issue is. And I think I would say the same thing with my dad, actually. For the first time I ever heard him say something like, if Trump is if a Republican Party is the party of Trump, then I'm not a Republican. And which he never voted, like he always voted Republican his entire life. He's a pastor, Assemblies of God, I think very conservative, ultra conservative pastor.
Mm-hmm. That's a Pentecostal sect. I don't want to say sect.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I understand. Cult, sect, whatever. No, but I kid.
I think he's going to be slayed in the spirit right here.
Yes, dude, I might, dude. Yeah.
Well, wait till you get. Wait till you get to the Washington for Jesus rally, which was a big rally on the Mall organized by Pentecostals.
Oh man.
There's a guy in there. There's one of the preachers. I couldn't identify him. I actually sent out some pictures of this guy to my Pentecostal friends. But one of the preachers had just gotten back from a refugee camp in Southeast Asia. Refugees from Cambodia, from the terrible wars they had there in the 1970s. And he said, "It's just great news. It's brought 30,000 Cambodians to the foot of the cross. This war has been great." Man.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. That's hard. But one of the things, though, the questions I have, and then I think will have one final one. But if you so we're thinking about conservatives and liberals in our country today. What lessons do you think we should learn from the past, from your writing? Like what lessons do we need to learn, or that you've learned that you would hope that we could learn, so that we're moving forward today, still keeping our unique identities and our unique thoughts, but at the same time able to, forge a path forward for
that's
country.
A really good way of putting it, because that's actually kind of how I would put it. A lot of people do say, "Oh, how can we unite as a country?" Right? And I think the most important thing I've learned, and the most kind of important thing I try to get across in my book, is a country as big and complicated and diverse as America is not really ever going to be kind of united. Unity is a reasonably good value, but it's not the most important value to me. Civility, going home after you lose, following the rules, yes, right? But often a call to unity at all costs in American history, and this is to answer your question about what I've learned from history, has often been cover for evading the imperative of justice, right? So when you think about, in the book Invisible Bridge, I kind of start out in the preface by talking about this explicitly. I talk about actually the period after the Civil War, where kind of like the elites everywhere, the most important thing, the most important public value was unity between the North and the South. And they would stage all these kind of really bizarre, rituals, parades with, kind of Union veterans and Confederate veterans, kind of walking down the street in Boston. But, meanwhile, what they were unifying behind was looking the other way while the South restored white supremacy, right? Unity was a way to not enforce, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments. So I think the most important thing I've learned is the moral, political, and even spiritual importance of feeling comfortable with kind of conflict, and not to paper it over. Because to me, the original sin in America is just kind of like what happened at the Constitutional Convention, where they're like, we'll just paper over this whole slavery thing and hope it goes away. And it just festered. Right? And to me, that's the pattern that repeats itself over and over in American history, because we've never really had that kind of truth and reconciliation. And before you can have reconciliation, you have to have acknowledgement of the wound, right? So, I think feeling comfortable with conflict is a really important thing for Americans to learn. And one of the things I liked the least about Reagan was that he basically shut that down with a rhetoric that basically said America's always the best, America's always the best, America's always the best, and basically systematically asked Americans to avert their gaze from kind of the tatters in our national fabric.
Wow. Now, my last question for you is, like we've all heard the term like Christian right or whatever, like it seems like most Christians seem to affiliate with the conservative or Republican Party because of like their self-described affinity for, morality and values and all this other kind of stuff, but like there are few conservatives that, aren't necessarily people of faith, like I'm thinking like Rick Wilson and, Trump, like come to mind. So like, I'm curious is what do you think is a good secular argument for social conservatism, like outside the context of faith?
Oh, that's
and have you seen that?
Well, I mean, that's when I say that the Democrats are a pretty pluralistic party with lots of different aspects in it. I think one of the cool things about being a liberal, since it's kind of a pluralist ideology and it's not about kind of like destroying the enemy, is you can see the value of conservative values, right? I mean, a good secular argument for the value of having we families, right, is something actually Jimmy Carter pushed very, very, very strongly. But he also said, one of the ways we need strong families is to have policies that make it easier for people to take care of their families, like having better subsidies for home health care, right? And that's like the most powerful secular argument for conservatism that I write about in the book. I don't think they were good intellectual arguments, but they were convincing arguments to a lot of people at the time. Were these arguments about trickle down economics, right? There were that basically if the rich are able to keep their money, they'll create jobs for the rest of us, right? So that was certainly a secular argument. I don't think it's a good one, right? But I mean, I think that I think social policies that kind of generally speaking kind of reward effort and work, that's taken to be a conservative value. They're always talking about people on the dole and people living the wealth, the safety net has become a hammock. But I mean, if you really want to talk about people, the how hard it is to sustain a healthy society when people don't feel like their work is rewarded, then you start talking about things like minimum wage and clamping down on private equity. I heard yesterday, when private equity buys a nursing home, this guy was like, I was getting $3 more an hour as a personal shopper for Amazon groceries than I was as a CNA at a nursing home, right? So when you're talking about stability, and people being able to take care of each other, and being able to be free and independent, to be able to live, a life of dignity without dependency, then the state has to do stuff. It has to protect people from depredations, because we live in a society in which corporations are very powerful, right? I mean, a lot of conservatives describe themselves as, I'm a classical liberal, right? By which they mean weak government. But classic liberals who came about in the 18th century, that was before they had Walmart, which is bigger than a lot of countries, right? So you need a somewhat strong state to protect yourself from Walmart, right? So I think the best secular argument for conservatism at its best is that it creates liberty. It creates liberty in the sense of not just liberty from the government, but liberty to leave your job if you don't like your job. Liberty to basically raise your family in kind of comfort and some degree of stability, right? I mean, to me, another word for this is liberalism. So there.
Because it's almost like my biggest issue with a lot of conservative policies
Uncle
is,
Joe. It's a sweet old man who's in the White House who's all about us taking care of each other.
Like with traditional like conservatism, it's like smaller government, with the exception of like what you do in the bedroom. Then we want big government. Like I don't want same sex marriage. For a variety of different reasons, so I'm going to legislate that, like I'm going to say that you can't marry whoever it is you want, and I just, for some reason, like I have a hard time believing, like if you are a person without faith, how could you make an argument against like same-sex marriage in the Conservative Party? For me, it just seems very nonsensical. Now, if you were a person of faith, I can connect the dots to understand where you're coming from, but for people that don't have faith, I don't see how you can. It
seems like there's a lot more in the Bible about, why you shouldn't eat shellfish than, why you shouldn't lie with a man as you would a woman,
Mm-hmm.
But that's just me.
I can make a pretty good argument why you shouldn't eat shellfish, just because it's gross. But that's just me. But so anyways, what's next for you, Rick? Like what do you got? What do you got working on? What do you?
I'm doing a bunch of different things. I can't really, kind of like I've been literally working on this project since 1997, since I was in my 20s, and now I'm in my 50s. So
got it.
I'm still doing these interviews and writing articles about, contemporary politics, but, looking to get back to the 19th century.
That's nice. And, how'd you make out during, the last year with COVID?
Thanks for asking. Within these four walls, life has been pretty good. So it's kind of given me that sort of strength and stability and base to, try and serve. Try, do my best to do.
Yeah, I always joke with some of my friends that like I have these recurring nightmares where like life's going to return back to normal and I have to start hanging out with people again.
Yeah.
Because I'm generally an introvert. Kind of
I'm not introverted, but I've had plenty of opportunities to it's like my advice during a pandemic when you're locked down is to publish a big book because you'll get a lot of interaction with lots of other human beings.
Darn it. Missed my opportunity.
You missed it, dude.
We're going to get another one. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rick, for spending some time with us. We really appreciate it. You're really fun to talk to and just a wealth of information. And for those that haven't read any of his books, you've got a lot to choose from. Just buy them now, so when the next pandemic hits, you can sit back and read them all. And thank you, Rick.
Great. Well, you guys are doing a good job. Keep on.
All right. Thanks, guys. And thank you to our listeners. We will see you next week. Bye.